Hi there, I'm Gareth Cooper, and welcome to my Not Fringe project. This is where I'm playing an acoustic song for every day the Edinburgh Fringe is not happening this year. This song, I don't know why I said it like that. This song is from what was going to be my 2020 show. It's also on my new album, Comedy Songs, so do check that one out. And it's pretty much where we're all going to end up, so listen good. You wanted a fortnight in Vegas, but you ended up in Brighton on the two-piece slot machines. You wanted to look fly in a tuxedo, but you're wearing a shirt from Oxfam and a dirty pair of jeans. You wanted a stripper, but you're stuck watching free anime porn online. You wanted 8 bottles of champers, but since you can't afford it, you're stuck drinking Tesco value wine. You're having a cheap midlife crisis. A cheap midlife crisis. You wanted a high-class escort, instead you're chilling with your mum. When you've got no cash, having a nervous breakdown's way less fun. You're having a cheap midlife crisis. Cheap midlife crisis. You wanted to quit your job, so you told your boss to go fuck himself. And then the very next morning, you begged for your job back due to your crippling lack of wealth. You wanted a Ferrari, but you had to borrow your dad's Fiat Punto. You wanted to go on safari, but sure, walking around your local park in Croydon is just as fun, though. You're having a cheap midlife crisis. A cheap midlife crisis. You left your wife of 20 years cause you felt trapped in a cage. Now you're sat in Weatherspoons, staring at girls half your age. You're having a cheap midlife crisis. Cheap midlife crisis. You wanted a tattoo, so you used a biro and a pin. You wanted to take drugs, so your friend introduced you to heroin, which is really cheap, by the way, guys. You're having a cheap midlife crisis. Cheap midlife crisis. Heroin.